Dr. Ted Naiman. Adipose tissue controls insulin resistance. Hypertrophy drives insulin spikes.
It turns out that as you get fatter, your fat cells can do one of two things. You can have adipocyte hypertrophy, and that's where your fat cell gets overstuffed with fat. And it's inflamed, and it's insulin resistant, and it doesn't want any more fat or glucose. Or you can have adipocyte hyperplasia. If you have the right genetics, you can sprout cute new little baby fat cells that are very insulin sensitive, and they're happy to suck up more fat, and they're not inflamed, and they're not insulin resistant. So not all your fat cells are alike, right? Your ginormous, huge, overstuffed fat cells are super inflamed, they're sick, they're dying, they're spewing out fat constantly. It takes a crap ton of insulin to shove fat in there. The fat doesn't want to stay in there. But your cute little baby fat cells are very insulin sensitive, and they're more than happy to suck up more fat flux, right? So you can have two people of identical obesity, and the person who's overstuffed their fat cells and had adipocyte hypertrophy is going to be inflamed and insulin resistant, and it takes a ton of insulin to shove any more fat in there, and the fat is constantly spewing back out. But somebody who can sprout new little baby fat cells is going to stay insulin sensitive forever. If you have the right genetics and you can just sprout new fat cells, this hyperplasia, you could be 600 pounds. And as long as you have some small fat cells around to still suck up more fat, you're going to be totally insulin sensitive. This is about 10% of obese people. Fat is typically stored in the subcutaneous first, and then it spills over into visceral, and then it spills over into liver and muscle and pancreas and blood vessels, and you've got ectopic fat, and you have fat everywhere, and then you're horribly insulin resistant. Here's a sort of a schematic of how it works. You fill up your subcutaneous adipose first, it spills over into visceral, that spills over into liver and muscle, and now you've got ectopic fat, and none of your tissues want any fat or glucose, and now you're insulin resistant. My favorite term when it comes to this concept is personal fat threshold. PFT, this is a genetic limit to how fat you can get before you just can't get fatter and you're insulin resistant. This explains people who are TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. These are people who look thin, but they've completely maxed out their fat source, subcutaneous and visceral, and they're horribly insulin resistant or maybe completely diabetic. This is why China and India have passed up diabetes prevalence compared to the US at a much lower body mass index, right? Personal fat threshold. I love this graph right here. It takes a ton of insulin to shove that much fat into an adipocyte and hold it there and to pin it there tonically. And that fat is constantly trying to spew back out. And that's why people who've maxed out their fat cells just have high insulin 24/7. This is a beautiful illustration. Okay, the best example we have of adipose tissue controlling insulin resistance is lipodystrophy. Lipodystrophy is a series of disorders where you don't have any subcutaneous fat, or hardly any. I have a bunch of patients with lipodystrophy. They're very unique. They almost look ripped, like a bodybuilder. They have very defined arms and legs. They have very little subcutaneous fat, but they have a lot more visceral fat than you would expect. If you do cross-sectional imaging on these people, the subcu fat in red here is very, very small, but the visceral fat is completely maxed out. And almost everyone with lipodystrophy has horrible insulin resistance and horrible brittle diabetes. All of my lipodystrophy patients really bad diabetes. So here's how it works so far, right? You fill up your subcutaneous fat, then it spills over into visceral, that spills over into liver and muscle. Now you've got ectopic fat, you've got fat everywhere. None of your cells want fat, none of your tissues want fat, you're insulin resistant. What's really going on here is your body is at war with itself, right? None of your cells want fat, none of your tissues want fat, none of them want glucose either, none of them want any of this energy, and it's like this horrible game of musical chairs where insulin just gets louder and louder and louder until you finally shove some fat or glucose into whatever cell or tissue is the least insulin resistant, and next time it'll probably be even more insulin resistant.
There are two types of adipocyte cells. Those that are in hypertrophy. These are fat cells that are overstuffed, inflamed, and have insulin resistance. And those that are hyperplasia, they're constantly making new baby cells, and these are insulin sensitive. If you have the right genetics, Then you make new fat cells, and these will stay insulin sensitive. No matter how much you weigh, you can stay insulin sensitive. About 10% of obese people are in this situation. What causes the insulin resistance underlying obesity? First, excess lipids go into the subcutaneous adipose tissue, then into the visceral adipose tissue, and finally into the liver and muscles, and everything becomes insulin resistant. TOFI, thin outside, fat inside. A person may look thin, but they have maxed out their fat cells. Subcutaneous fat cells, visceral fat cells. They are insulin resistant and perhaps diabetic. This is why China and India have passed up the diabetes prevalence compared to the United States, with much less body mass index. Adipose tissue controls insulin resistance. Lipodystrophy is a series of disorders where you have no subcutaneous fat. These people have more visceral fat. They often have horrible insulin resistance and horrible diabetes. Annotated and summarized. Easy to share with loved ones. The description below the title for this video has these summary points.